After months of hype, Roger Waters' new version of a classic Pink Floyd album is finally here. Does it honor the legacy of the original? Or is it a spectacular train wreck? My review of Dark Side of the Moon Redux is coming up next on Track by Track. Hey everybody, my name's Kyle and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for tuning in today, and if this is your first time here, please take a moment to hit subscribe so you won't miss future reviews and more. It would not be hyperbole to say that Dark Side of the Moon Redux by Roger Waters has been the most highly anticipated classic rock-related release of 2023. In the absence so far of any official Beatles announcements, the 50th anniversary of the iconic Pink Floyd album has dominated the classic rock conversation, and indeed more so about Roger's new version than the original. Part of that is the fault of Pink Floyd themselves, with the utterly underwhelming set of releases put out to commemorate the milestone anniversary, giving most fans very little to be excited about. For better or worse, Roger Waters' new take on the album turned out to be the most interesting thing to happen to Dark Side of the Moon on its golden anniversary. Although the disappointing Dark Side box set details were announced in January, the real fireworks started in February when news of Waters' Redux project came out in an interview. You may recall that's when Roger brazenly claimed full credit for the album with this incendiary quote. "I wrote Dark Side of the Moon. Let's get rid of all this we crap. Of course, we were a band. There were 4 of us. We all contributed, but it's my project and I wrote it. So, blah." Roger has dialed back that rhetoric a bit since then and repeatedly stated how proud he is of what they as a band created. But in spite of his limply apologetic comments in the months leading up to his album's release, can there be any doubt that his original statement was the truest reflection of his feelings on the matter? So, throughout the year, there's been a lot of talk about this project, about Roger's intentions, should he do it at all, and will he tarnish the legacy of the original album? Let me make my opinion on these things clear. Roger Waters has every right to re-record the album, not just because he was one of the creators of the original, but also because anyone can. You want to record a new version of Dark Side? Knock yourself out. Will your version or Waters' version somehow damage the original? Not at all. All the different versions of Dark Side, and there's been a lot of them over the past 5 decades, can peacefully coexist in the massive shadow of the iconic source material. And by the way, I think it is important to remember that if you're watching this video, you're very likely part of a very passionate but ultimately very small part of the fan base that actually cares this much to talk about it in such detail. The legacy of Dark Side of the Moon was not built upon fans like us, but rather upon the millions and millions of people who have bought and cherished the album over the past 50 years, many of whom do not own any other albums by Pink Floyd. They'd be hard-pressed to name the members of the band who were famously faceless in their prime, and they have little interest in a new version of the album by Roger Waters or anyone else. So to that end, Dark Side of the Moon Redux is for you and for me. Few others care beyond possibly sampling a track or two on Spotify or YouTube. But let's get back to the why of this project, because there's the reason Waters is given for this endeavor, and then there's the ironically unspoken reason that's perhaps at the heart of it all. What Waters has stated about the project is that he essentially wanted to revisit the album now from the perspective of a man 50 years older than when he first created it. Considering how much the themes of Dark Side center around life and mortality, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. I think the words Waters authored back in 1973 must resonate quite differently for him so many decades later, not to mention for the fans as well. I mean, I discovered this album when I was 16 and I thought I would live forever. I'm only a couple years older than this album, and there's no doubt it hits different for me in 2023. So yes, Waters' rationale for the Redux is not mad, as he has asked. It's very sane indeed, to say nothing of whether or not it has been well executed upon. But then there's the underlying why, the reasoning that he not so subtly revealed in that now infamous quote from February of this year. In Waters' mind, Dark Side of the Moon has always been his album. David Gilmour, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason were not creative partners, but rather merely tools to get the job done. They were replaceable. And with this Redux, Waters endeavors to illustrate exactly that. Now, you can say what you want about his original solo material. It was exactly that, solo, without any involvement from his former bandmates. But whether he likes it or not, they were involved and present on that iconic album. So now, with the Redux version following his statements regarding their irrelevancy, to phrase it bluntly, Waters must put up or shut up. He needs to show how the work still stands strong in their absence. That absence actually seems to become a new theme for the album. Let's face it, we can't objectively listen to any new version of these songs without the original recordings lingering in the back of our minds. In the very notable absence of his former bandmates, Waters has to find a way to fill that void, and he does so in the most obvious way. In the hole where there once was Gilmour, Mason, and Wright, we now have more Roger Waters. Since he was never even remotely at the level of musicianship of the others, always the wordsmith of the group, his choice to cover over their absence with much more of his own pontificating is truly the fatal flaw of this project. Setting aside Roger's words, new and old, for a moment, his entire argument about his authorship of Dark Side of the Moon spectacularly falls apart. There are multiple passages on the original album where the music speaks more effectively than words ever could. Yet on the Redux, Waters feels vainly compelled, if not obligated, to give voice to all of those segments. Anywhere there was once a characteristic contribution from Gilmour, Mason, Wright, or even Claire Torrey and Dick Perry, for God's sake, we now have Roger waxing poetic, reframing Darkside as a mostly spoken word performance. And that's perhaps what this whole thing should have been in the first place. If Waters felt the need to show how non-essential his bandmates were to the album, he should have done so completely on his own and let his words and voice speak for themselves. But the fact that he substitutes his words and voice for their instrumental contributions and then backs it all up with a surrogate band shows both a lack of bravery and lack of musical talent. After all, Waters has spent every waking moment since leaving Pink Floyd trying to state his case that he is Pink Floyd. And it has never been more painfully clear that he is not than on this album. And just so it's been said, Gilmour hasn't won that battle either, although Dave has never fought it as vociferously as Roger. If anything, Dark Side of the Moon Redux confirms what most fans have long known, that Pink Floyd was always a band that was far greater than the sum of its parts. They were destined to break up, but it was perhaps the very tension that drove them to that point that was the catalyst for so much great music in the first place. Now, in the absence of tension, Roger is finally surrounded by collaborators that are content to follow his every whim without question. It's a syndrome that is all too common among successful artists. They reach a point where no one will tell them no or advise them against whatever quixotic path they feel they must travel to satisfy their own vanity. In fairness, they owe us nothing. They can do what they want, and they have more than earned that right. But we are under no obligation to like it, to compliment it, to buy it, to support it. But no matter what, we would still be here, you and I, the hardcore Pink Floyd fans, picking apart all the details. In advance of the album's release, we've heard 4 of the tracks as previews, so listening to the entire thing now doesn't bring many surprises. We knew it would be full of lengthy spoken word passages, a choice that by itself was guaranteed to be polarizing for fans. He launches into his monologuing right from the start and leans especially heavily into it on the first half of the album. The augmentation on tracks like Time and Money was only mildly obnoxious when we heard them alone as singles, but by the time we hear them in the full song cycle, we're desperate for anything resembling singing, if only for a palate cleanser. Waters' rambling stories that now clutter once instrumental pieces like On the Run, Great Gig in the Sky, or Any Color You Like would be tedious even if you didn't know what the original versions sounded like. Then there's moments that feel cheap, where Roger's new words feel so on the nose that you roll your eyes. Any Color You Like, for example, has a concluding passage that takes the title literally, managing to reference both the current conflict in Ukraine and LGBTQ rights. Then at the start of Brain Damage, he jokes about how he must be mad to re-record Dark Side of the Moon. It's a meta moment, for sure, but not particularly clever. I'm sure it will get great applause when he says it during the live performances, though. So obviously I am not a fan of all the spoken word additions to the album. I find almost none of it compelling as content on its own, let alone within the context of the Dark Side song cycle. Yet when Roger plays it straight and just, sings the songs, it rarely results in anything inspiring either. Money was the first single released, and as it turns out, it's the best track on the album in spite of the whole boxing monologue. It's the one time on the album where Waters feels at all adventurous or like he's doing something truly innovative with the source material. Most of the other singing performances fall flat. Perhaps the worst of these is Us and Them, where in spite of Waters playing it straight and faithful for the longest continuous stretch on the album, he shines the brightest spotlight on the empty spaces he cannot possibly fill. His vocals pale painfully compared to the Gilmour-Wright combo on the original version, and the echoing words make the whole thing come across as almost karaoke. Then there's the chorus segments that sound like you're listening to a cassette player with dying batteries. Thank God for the instrumental bridge section, though, where Roger finally steps away from the microphone for a couple minutes and gives the band their only opportunity to do anything remotely approaching interesting. Throughout the rest of the album, every song feels like Waters' performance is layered over the blandest of musical paste, with his band's demo-quality accompaniment often offering just enough melody to anchor his words to what would otherwise be almost unrecognizable source material. Dark Side of the Moon Redux is ultimately not much more than a curious experiment. I wouldn't call it a train wreck, but neither would I dispute those who would. No one, including Waters himself, expected this version to replace the original, but I do seriously question the replayability of the whole thing. I can't imagine many of us will be listening to this with any frequency after the novelty of it wears off. And before you start defending the album too enthusiastically, ask yourself this. Do you really want Waters to follow this up with Wish You Were Here, featuring lengthy new soliloquies spread across a sonic soundscape that vaguely resembles Shine On You Crazy Diamond? I've done a lot of Pink Floyd and Roger Waters videos on this channel, and for many years I've considered myself a huge fan of both. When I've been critical of Waters here, there's always comments that defend him as a musical genius. I have long wanted to believe that was true, but the man hasn't done anything post-Floyd that could possibly justify that label. He claims to have been the mastermind behind their best work. If that's true, why haven't we seen that level of artistry in his solo career? His sparse original output during the past 3 decades has been mediocre or good at best. And his obsession with reworking his music from the Pink Floyd era has done more to highlight his shortcomings than to showcase his self-proclaimed brilliance. That's never been more the case than on this latest effort, and that makes me sad. So I'm giving Dark Side of the Moon Redux by Roger Waters an X rating of 3 out of 10. It's a tedious, pretentious, pointless exercise that feels more vainly self-congratulatory than celebratory of its source. Dark Side deserves better, especially from one of its creators. Once again, my name's Kyle, and this has been Track by Track. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Plus, be sure to check out some of these other videos below that I think you might also enjoy. And of course, be sure to click subscribe, because true music fans always want new releases the day they come out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.